everyone, and thanks for joining us again on the Seafood Matters podcast. You can help me by pressing subscribe and sharing it with family and friends. In this episode, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Bryce Stewart. Bryce is a senior research fellow at the Marine Biological Association and an associate professor at the University of Plymouth. He grew up in Australia and Papua New Guinea, but moved to the UK 25 years ago. He has been conducting research into marine ecology and fisheries for over 30 years, with a particular focus on how to balance the needs of fisheries with the needs of marine conservation. Hi, Bryce. Welcome to Seafood Matters.
Hi, Jim. Thanks so much. Great to be here.
Thank you. Excellent. It will just kick off on the film Oceans with David Attenborough. What was your gut reaction when you saw the Attenborough piece calling for full-on ban on bottom trawling?
Yeah, so I mean the segment I assume you're referring to, where there's the underwater footage of bottom trawling, is very powerful. You know, I've seen it at the cinema, and it is quite affecting. I would say that Attenborough himself doesn't call for a full-on ban, so he obviously is not casting bottom trawling in a very positive light. But he doesn't, either in the film or elsewhere, call for a full ban of bottom trawling. But obviously, since the release of the film, and in fact before it as well, a number of NGOs have been calling particularly for a ban on bottom trawling in marine protected areas. So I think we're going to talk about that a bit later on. But yeah, I'm happy to sort of talk about that.
Good. Do high-profile documentaries have a duty to show balanced science? Or is good photography and clever storytelling enough to shape public opinion?
I mean, as a scientist, I would obviously say that good science is super important, particularly any film or documentary that has a scientific angle. Um, and this film did consult with a number of scientists, and it is very much based on science. A lot of what's in there, particularly around the importance of the ocean for various ecosystem services, like the way it regulates the climate and stabilizes sediment and absorbs carbon dioxide and all these other things, and provides seafood, is very much in there, as is a lot of the work at the in the second part of the film about marine protected areas. But I guess I've seen, probably like you, some different opinions online, because science is fundamentally based on evidence, but that evidence can be interpreted differently by different people, and scientists, and the sort of I guess our training is all about being objective as possible in light of the evidence that we see. But you're still going to see different opinions on exactly what that evidence means, and also in terms of issues like how best to manage fisheries or to protect the sea. Different people have different opinions, whether they're scientists or not, and I think that's what we're seeing basically. So it would be almost impossible to produce a film that about the ocean, or probably almost anything that all scientists agreed on, if that makes sense.
Totally, it makes sense. And I wouldn't say even fishermen would say, I mean, Sir David's not a villain, but there's a danger that it's telling a half story. And when you've got the voice of God, as he's seen at times, and a global platform, can have a story do real damage. I mean, Ocean goes on about the impact from bottom trawling, but fails to mention things like aggregate dredging, seabed mining, offshore wind zones, taking up massive seabed areas, and the pipeline and cabling. A lot more going on the seabed than bottom trawling.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, there's loads of impacts on the ocean. Obviously we've got climate change, we've got pollution, we've got coastal development in all its forms, runoff from the land, we have invasive species or introduced species. So there's lots of different things. But the general consensus in terms of the largest impact on marine biodiversity, over the last few centuries, particularly, is fishing. And this is backed up by um, things like the International Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services in their recent report. So I mean, Sir David, I don't know how much of the film he wrote. Obviously, it's a very much a collaborative effort, but I think what what people have to remember here is this is a global film designed for um, a global public audience, and the way most media operates is it can't get too complicated. So I don't think in one film you could deal with all of those issues and keep the public engaged in it. So they've looked at fishing as being the single biggest thing that can be changed, but also and maybe I'll come back to this later, but the film has a lot to say about the importance of seafood and fisheries as well. So okay, yes, it doesn't cover absolutely everything because I don't think it possibly could. Um, but I think it's made a choice to tell a certain story, and that's because that's the one that's going to um, probably be the most effective in what it's trying to do.
It was premiered, the film, with royalty, celebrities, and global NGOs, a film that has so much to say about fishing, but is it strange fishermen and fisheries scientists were noticeable by their absence?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure exactly who was at the premiere. There were a lot of people there, I believe, and I think no, it didn't have lots of fishermen or lots of fisheries scientists there, but there were some. And one of the sort of features of the film is not just the narration of David Attenborough, but these other four key people from around the world, one from Scotland, one from Liberia, one from California, and one from Hawaii. And all of them, well, two of them are active fishermen, and one of the others was a fisherman, and then the other one is closely connected to fishing communities. I think some of them were at the premiere, at least, and there were a variety of scientists as well. Certainly, in terms of people who research things like marine protected areas, which was very much the focus of the second part of the film. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I didn't control the invite list, but I think the main thing they were doing there was inviting obviously a lot of media, a lot of journalists, but there were also a lot of people who and different organisations who backed the film, and so they were guests as well, and other people involved in the filmmaking. I think a film like this, I don't know exactly, but it's going to have involved hundreds, if not more than 1,000 people to put it together. It's 3 or 4 years worth of work, and I think that's probably the main reason why different people got invited.
I think one of the things that people have spoken to or feel a bit strange is they mention trawling in the UK, but the film, it was filmed in Turkey.
Yeah, I mean, look, that is the case, and I guess that emphasizes the point that you know um, it's a global film, and trawling still occurs in other places. Whether or not it will look exactly like that if it was filmed in the UK remains to be seen. I don't think such footage exists in that kind of definition. Um, but yeah, I don't. I mean, they can't film it everywhere, and it wasn't necessarily going to be filmed in the UK because it's not just a UK film. It's very much a global film, so it's using that footage to sort of emphasize what that practice looks like, I guess.
I think you've been very fair, and I appreciate that, given it. I mean, one of the dangers that people feel is with Attenborough having power and the fishing sector none. Do you think it's a fair fight or environmental bullying?
I definitely wouldn't call it environmental bullying. I Attenborough obviously is highly influential, and he is considered to be one of the most trusted voices. Um, so I don't see it as personally as a fight. I mean, it does have strong things to say about certain types of fishing, particularly bottom trawling, and particularly some of the larger industrial um, types of fishing. But like I said, there's also a lot of stuff that's quite pro fishing, to be honest. In the opening segment, it talks about how seafood is an essential part of the diet of billions of people, and it's an essential part of the livelihoods of coastal communities. So it's not necessarily a fight against fishing. And I guess I wouldn't also say that, it varies around the world, and it varies between different sectors of the fishing industry. But I definitely wouldn't say they don't have any power. So if you look at, for example, the profile that fisheries have had leading up to the Brexit referendum, and then since then, I mean, obviously, that recent events might give you a different impression, but fishing actually, enjoyed an incredibly high profile for the last 10 years. And certainly it didn't get everything that it was, for example, promised in the Brexit referendum. But it did get something, and it got a lot of airtime. So I think, first of all, I don't think it's a fight, but also I think, you know, fortunately, there's a lot of good people. I was listening to Mike Park's podcast that you've already recorded, and there's a really great voice for the industry there, and others like him. So yeah, I wouldn't say there's no power, but I also don't see it as a fight personally. It's an airing of views from different sectors who all have legitimate points.
That's fair. Yeah.
Okay.
What examples have you seen of meaningful change in UK fisheries?
Yeah, so like I said, I've lived in the UK now for about 25 years, and I would say there's been a pretty dramatic change since I've been here. So particularly in the sort of early 2000s, and I think most people in the industry would say this is fair. There were a lot of problems. There was a lot of fish stocks that were quite overfished. There was overcapacity. There was even a lot of illegal fishing going on as well, and sometimes quite blatantly. But things have changed a lot since then. So, some of the more technical things that, if you're not in this industry, might sound a bit boring, things like the Buyers and Sellers Act in 2005, which meant anyone buying or selling seafood had to be registered, really cleaned things up. Um, I think we started to recognize as well the state of some of the fish stocks in different areas. Not all of them, but definitely some of them were in trouble. Um, we saw things like, despite what you think about the common fisheries policy, which didn't work well at all for several decades, was reformed in a process from 2009 to eventually 2013, which led to a lot of improvements. So we saw, for example, the political decisions starting to follow the science much more closely, and fish stocks really starting to recover as well. And then, also most recently, we've had the new Fisheries Act for the UK that came through after Brexit, which is really, it's a fantastic piece of legislation. It gives me hope, certainly, that things should continue to improve. So we've got, for example, this the implementation of the fisheries management plans coming in, and you can see that this is all working. So we have seen a lot of stocks improving their sustainability. We're not out of the woods. There's still a few that we either don't know much about, or some still overfished. If you look at things like the number of fisheries certified by the Marine Stewardship Council in the last, say, 15 to 20 years, it's really increased rapidly, and I think that's quite a good testimony. And then from the sort of flip side, from the conservation point of view, we have seen a lot of changes. When I came here, there was, I think, 3 marine protected areas. Now, obviously, not all fishermen are fans of them, but in terms of sort of um, protecting a lot of key and vulnerable habitats and generally increasing the health of the ecosystem, there's been a lot of progress. Again, we're not there yet, but there's, from where we were, I've seen huge improvement. So I like to try and remain optimistic that we're on the right path.
I know from recent podcasts with people, do you feel that one of the key things in all this is good management?
Yeah, absolutely. Good management, but that management has to be carefully and well designed. And a really fundamental to that is working closely with the fishing industry. So, you can, as a scientist, I'm starting to do this more and more, is work quite directly with fishermen to actually design our surveys and to gather data as well. So we've recently finished a project on pollock in the southwest of the UK, a fisheries industry science partnership project, where we worked with both recreational charter boats and also commercial fishermen to gather data on the health of the stock and to try and assess how management was working, but also their ideas for management in the future. And I mean, it's just been a fantastic exercise in terms of we've been able to do so much more than we could have done otherwise and gather information that scientists just couldn't hope to even come across. But also, I think, working together like that really helps to build trust. And, I've done a couple of studies on this, and not surprisingly, you find that fishermen and scientists who work together trust each other so much more than otherwise. And so I think that's very much the way forward.
It's interesting you say that because I just worry at times that between fishermen, scientists, and NGOs, is there much trust?
Well, it very much depends on the people. And so this is what our research found. So, you can, like, so we worked out this way of allocating a trust score, and we surveyed about 50 fishermen all around the UK. And what you found is, although in those different sectors, say management, scientists, NGOs, etc., there was a mean score. There was a lot of spread, and when you talk to people, it came down a lot to the personalities, say, of the scientists involved and how much they've worked with the industry before. Um, and so, for example, you could find, just to take my sector, academics who were highly trusted, but other academics who weren't at all. And so I think, again, it comes back to my point that if you're open-minded, then there's a lot to learn in both directions. I mean, way back, I used to work on the Isle of Man about 20 years ago, and our university sold our research vessel, which was quite upsetting at the time. But we still had research funding, so we approached the commercial sector there. This was on scallop fisheries, and said, can we charter your boat? So suddenly we went from sort of doing our own thing on our research vessels to working on board commercial boats, for weeks at a time. And even within one of the first days, one of the skippers said to me, do you know what? We actually just want the same thing. We want healthy fisheries. We want healthy seas. And, that was just like music to my ears, basically.
It's very true. Yeah. I mean, when you say, why do you think? Maybe I shouldn't ask you this. You're not a qualified psychologist, but why do you think progress in fishing doesn't get the same coverage as problems?
Yeah, gosh. I mean, I think unfortunately there's a tendency among many people to focus on negative stories and negative news. Like you just switch on the television and you can see that. Um, there's lots of like bad news on the news, and which of course is partly because there's a lot of bad stuff happening, unfortunately, but also, people are fascinated by watching documentaries about murders and all sorts of things. Personally, you know, that's not everyone, and I sort of tried to take the approach of highlighting the good news in both fisheries and marine conservation. And so when I do public talks, for example, whether it's to a bunch of other scientists, or even just a couple of weeks ago, I did one down in Plymouth at the National Marine Aquarium, and the title of my talk was Ocean Optimism, and it was all about these sort of success stories, because I think you need to tell people that they're out there and that there are solutions if we work together. And I think it's a really important message to sort of highlight.
Do you feel there's enough public understanding on how regulated UK fishing actually is?
Uh, Probably not. I mean, fisheries management is extremely complicated. I mean, I would say that as a fisheries scientist, but I think it is. I mean, and I'm sure a lot of any fisherman listening to this program would think that as well. So yeah, as a scientist, it would be great if the average people, and particularly our politicians, really understood the complexity of it all. And I think, you know, how difficult it can be sometimes to actually work out what rules apply to you and the way and your particular fishery. And I think that would help with, just to, probably generate a little bit more sympathy and understanding for some of the challenges that face the fishing industry. I've recently been doing a lot of work with inshore fishermen around England. It's part of a project led by Sarah Coulthard, who I think you also might be interviewing. Um, and you know, we've actually spent a lot of time in workshops talk with fishermen there, paid to come along, and that's been really great. And just to let them talk and hear about a lot of the challenges that they have to deal with. So I think, yeah, absolutely, it would be good, but it's difficult because it is a complicated topic, and not just the level of different regulations, but all the other sort of challenges that being a fisherman in this day and age involves.
Indeed. Yeah, well, I have done recording with Sarah. She came across
Oh,
very
okay,
well. Yeah.
good, good.
Are you for or against abandoned bottom trawling in MPAs in the UK?
So I would say that very much depends on the marine protected area and what it was set up for. So there are some marine protected areas that are set up to protect seabed species and habitats that are vulnerable to being trawled or dredged. So, yes, those ones should be protected. Some of them are, some of them are not yet. I believe, there's the government has plans, but these plans have been rolling on for quite a number of years. Um, Other marine protected areas beyond those ones, I think, need to be treated on a case by case basis. So, we have a lot of marine protected areas here in the UK. Cover something like 38% of our sort of seas around this bit of the UK. That's not to mention all the international bits, which is a huge amount. Now, a lot of that area or percentage is made up of these very large marine protected areas that some of them are designed to protect things like seabirds and whales and dolphins, porpoises, etc. And because of the mobility of those species, these areas are necessarily large. Now, yes, I can see the argument that some people use that we should completely ban all, or at least bottom trawling or whatever else in those areas, because even though a seabird or a porpoise feeds near the surface most of the time, maybe occasionally it dives down and feeds on the seabed, or you could argue that uh, you know that that whole area of sea is an ecosystem that should be maintained in its natural state. But my personal view is that we need to be a bit more nuanced than that, because that's all well and good, but in some cases it's probably taking things too far, and clearly that would have a huge impact on the fishing industry if we did that overnight. Close off an awful lot of important fishing grounds. So Yeah, I think it needs to be done, like I say, on a sort of case by case basis after a proper sort of both environmental and social and economic assessment, rather than just blanket saying that all trawling should be banned in all MPAs.
With alternatives to bans, so like MPA, seasonal closure, gear innovation.
Yes, there are loads. So, look, marine protected areas, and I've seen this through my own research, particularly for species that are relatively sedentary, like scallops and lobsters, they can actually provide benefits for both conservation and fisheries, because the species that you protect stay in those areas. They grow numerous and large and very reproductively active, and their larvae and their young does spill out into the surrounding areas. And we've done that research, and others have as well. Um, but it is only part of the package. So yes, you can set up seasonal or even mobile marine protected areas that depend on. So some of the things you see, like I know in Norway and even off Scotland, they've done these real-time protected areas. So if it's discovered there's a lot of juvenile fish in an area, it's protected for say 30 or 60 days, and then it's checked, and then and potentially opened at that point. So those things are very, very good. Um, One of the ideas that I'd like to see used more widely is actually areas which I like to call them go fish areas. So GFAs rather than MPAs. So and they have these areas set up off the Yorkshire coast for scallop dredging. So these are called the scallop boxes, and there's two of these boxes that are open for 6 months of the year. The habitat there is relatively resilient. The sediment's somewhat mobile. That's quite um, used to a lot of natural disturbance, and so the effects of things like trawling and dredging are much less in those types of areas. But it supports scallops, so they open these areas up under license. And the boats are monitored, and they're able to fish there. It's good both in terms of a fisheries management measure, also as I mentioned for conservation, but it also reduces gear conflict, because that's an area off the North Yorkshire coast where there's a lot of potting for crabs and lobsters. And in the past, there's been issues with the mobile and the static gears sort of, yeah, basically having a few clashes between the use of different gear types in the same area. So, I'd like to see that sort of stuff as well. But of course, then we've got gear innovations, super important. There's been lots of progress in that area with putting things like sorting grids in prawn trawls, exclusion devices, not so relevant here, but turtle exclusion devices where they can escape through the top of the net, but other sort of escape hatches, modifications to the to the cod end, the coverless trawls, and dual cod ends that separate out different types of species. So all that stuff's really good. I mean, another interesting one I've had some involvement in is the scallop potting with lights, or the so-called scallop disco discovery, which is providing an alternative way to catch scallops. I think with all these innovations, though, I see this a lot in the scientific field, where we might work with either the fishing industry, come up with them themselves, or it's a collaboration between scientists and fishermen. Um, and there's fantastic ideas and really promising early results, but then they don't get the support going forward that they need, and so they just sometimes end up on the shelf, and they're not adopted more widely into fisheries. So I think that there's a real role there for certainly for the government to support that much more effectively, but probably also private sector as well. So yeah, there's absolutely lots of alternatives, and we need a mix of a whole lot of them, basically.
I think the ropeless potting is another one that sounds as if it could have a
Yeah,
positive
absolutely.
effect.
Yeah, there are lots of examples like that. The thing is, unfortunately, when they're new, they're often quite expensive, and people have to get used to them. And
Yeah.
this is why I'm saying you need that support to kind of get from that point of this is a great idea to actually everyone does this now. And like there's a role for the government to, they've got this big new £360 million fund for coastal communities. I don't know how that's going to be spent, but I'd like to see some of it spent supporting innovation in fisheries.
Yeah, it would certainly be a good way for it to go. It would be
Yeah,
an
yeah,
investment in the future.
sure. Yeah, absolutely.
What do you understand about the term just transition, and what relevance do you think it would have in the context of troll ban and MPAs?
Yeah, I mean, just transition is an interesting sort of phrase. You hear it a lot, particularly with reference to climate change and, us moving towards net zero. I think the main thing is, from my understanding, the term means not just suddenly stopping or banning one activity. It's like, think about electric cars. If the government made a ruling that no petrol or diesel cars were allowed on the road from tomorrow, well, a lot of us would be in a lot of trouble. Do you know what I mean? And so, if you think about it in terms of trawling, um, I mean, I think we'll talk about this in a little bit, but trawling does provide a lot of seafood in the world, and it provides a lot of jobs and livelihoods that are not just on the fishing boats, but also on shore as well. And it wouldn't be reasonable to suddenly ban all trawling by any means, or nor necessary. So, there are, as I sort of alluded to before, there's areas of the sea that are relatively resilient to trawling and dredging. I've published some work on this myself, and there's so much kind of nuance to all of this. But at the same time, I think the just transition that we can see is just going back to my previous point about innovation. So we want to transit to sort of, more and more environmentally friendly gear, because obviously that's important from a conservation point of view, but ultimately that will feed back to commercial fisheries as well. Because if you have healthier seabeds, for example, that's more food on the bottom. It's more sort of nursery um, and breeding habitat as well. So yeah, that's my sort of understanding of it. And like these things are happening, like we've seen a lot of innovation, and I think it will continue to happen, particularly with the right support.
Good. I like your positive approach to it. What do you think would be the biggest consequence of implementing or not implementing a ban on trawling in MPAs?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't obviously I haven't done a proper assessment on this. It would certainly affect quite a few fishing operations. You know, a lot of our most important fisheries, say in the UK, are based on trawling. So things like obviously Nephrops prawns, scallop dredging, but then also some of the key species people think about like cod and haddock and saithe and monkfish. Mostly caught by trawling, and some of that's in MPAs. And yeah, if you completely ban that, it would have a very dramatic effect on those industries. And I guess what it would also do, and this is something that we always have to be careful with, is it could cause displacement of effort. So basically, then what happens is, you increase your fishing pressure on the areas outside the MPAs, and that can have quite a negative effect, obviously. And so this is why we have to see the ocean as a whole system. And look, I've done a lot of work on MPAs, and I think they have a super important role, but they're only part of the solution. And even if their coverage does increase, they're only on part of the ocean. We do need to look after the whole package and think about um, the implications of one decision and how it might affect something else. I won't name names, but a former director of fisheries in DEFRA said to me, this is the ultimate fisheries management is the ultimate case of unintended consequences, or whack-a-mole, if you like. You fix one problem here, but another one pops over there,
Yeah.
and you really have to carefully plan for that and try and think it through. Um, in terms of not doing it, I guess, if we think about the habitats or the MPAs that are designed to set up to protect um, species and habitats on the seafloor, then if they do continue to be trawled and dredged, then they won't recover. So they're not going to achieve their objectives. And so we won't see the kind of return to health that we might otherwise see. So it's a balance, like everything.
Yeah, unintended consequence. That's a good way of putting it, because and that's why I feel sometimes with certain things you hear measures and that, I think the fishing conservation of fish is a hugely complex subject.
Mm-mm.
Well,
Absolutely.
I I suppose they have, maybe it's unfair for me to say it, and they have ways of they could justify it. But one of the things I often wonder is the MC Marine Conservation Society have a traffic light system where if it's red, you don't eat any of that species.
Okay.
If it's amber, you can eat it in moderation, and
Yeah, yeah.
if it's green, you can go at it as much as you want. But I just wonder if fishing conservation is more complex than three colours.
Yeah, I mean that system has a 5-point scale, and I guess you could look at, say, the Marine Stewardship Council, which has products that are either labelled or not. And um, in defence of that, I would say behind that is mostly a lot of other stuff. So something that gets a green rating will not just be hopefully not just be in a healthy condition now, but also be a well managed fishery. And that, for the Marine Stewardship Council, the eco label, that's very much the case. So it's a very rigorous process to get that certification. Um, and I think the other thing with all of these measures is what they're designed to do is move things in a certain direction. So, like, you know, they're designed to educate consumers and other people, retailers as well, and the general public. Um, I don't think they necessarily think that, for example, no one will ever eat a red rated fish again, because of course people will. But if you can use such a system to highlight the issues, then hopefully that will put pressure on the managers to sort of look into that fishery in more detail and try and manage it better. So that's my understanding of how those systems are designed to work. Um, but yeah, it's complicated.
I've had people, when I had a restaurant, seafood restaurant in the Scrabster in the port worked with and from, and I've had people looking at the menu and seeing maybe cod, for example, and saying, "No, I can't have that. That's
Mm.
so they're under pressure, and it's so they get a message across."
Yeah, absolutely, it does happen. And like you say, if you take the case of cod, I mean, most of the cod in the UK now, it comes from Norway or Iceland, where their fisheries are actually in a very good state. Um, Combination of probably good management and climate change. So, if you're eating cod from a fish and chip shop, it's probably absolutely fine. And so, yeah, unfortunately, those messages do get confused, and it comes back to our previous sort of discussion about the complexity of fisheries. And it's a hard thing to communicate.
Definitely. And the other thing that I just often wonder if where the logic is, if we were to just say ban, which I feel is not a good word, but if we had to start importing our fish into the country, which we do a lot of now,
Mm-mm.
well, there's a good chance that's going to be trawled, and there's going to be air miles added to it, and it might be a country that's not got the same standards as we have.
Yeah, I mean, like you say, we actually do import most of our seafood already because of preferences. I mean, a lot of it's farmed. So farmed salmon is by far the most popular sort of fish choice in this country. But then it's things like cod and haddock, which haddock a bit different. More, more of the haddock has come from sort of Scottish seas, but most cod from overseas. And then you've got things like tuna and prawns, which are basically all imported. Um, so we already do that. So maybe it wouldn't make much difference to that. But yeah, you do. Like again, this comes down to these unintended consequences, doesn't it? Um, yeah, you need to think of the implications of what you're doing. Much better to kind of. I mean, I'd love it, and I know a lot of people in the fishing industry would say this um, if we ate a lot more of the seafood and the diverse choice of seafood that there is available in the UK. Where I'm now based down in the southwest, I think they commonly land up to 60 different species of fish and shellfish in the fish market, say at Brixham. Um, but only about 5 of those would be eaten here regularly. So there is an opportunity for a lot more um, local seafood to be eaten in terms of a diversity of species, but also in terms of a diversity of sizes of fish as well. And some of the smaller pelagic species are actually really good to eat, and I would say better for us to be eating them directly than, say, for example, feeding them to, well, salmon or even now cats and dogs and stuff like that, because that seems like such a waste of a fabulous product.
I couldn't agree with you more on that. I think you've got a great example of that when you're down in the southwest, what they've done with Cornish sardines.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's a real success story, and they got onto that. I don't know how long ago it was, maybe 15 years ago. They started to sort of see the opportunity and change perceptions, and it has really paid off. And we need more of it.
I believe it's created jobs on the catching sector, processing
Mm,
sector. It's been great for the area.
absolutely. Yeah, no, I think people are doing pretty well out of it for sure.
It's great to hear. Does any common ground exist between the fishing industry and the NGO campaigns to ban trawling? And if so, how might this be built and the progress a way forward?
So I think it would very much depend on what you mean by the fishing industry. So obviously, there's not going to be much common ground between a trawl fisherman and an NGO who wants to ban bottom trawling. There are, for example, a lot of fishermen using static gear, so whether it be pots and nets or diving for scallops or that sort of thing, who do actually support trawling bans or dredging bans in certain areas. So for example, in Scotland, there's a campaign to protect the inner 3 miles from dredging and trawling, and then in other areas, again, there are campaigns that are supported by fishermen, but not by the trawl fishermen, clearly. So, yeah, I mean that needs to be factored in, and there are many reasons for that. I mean, you could talk to the fishermen themselves, but it's partly down to gear conflict, it's partly down to sort of separating out access to stocks. In general, inshore fishermen using those sort of static gears are having a pretty hard time at the moment for all sorts of reasons. I mean, again, in the southwest, we're seeing this octopus boom at the moment, which is wreaking havoc, to be honest. Um, so there is common ground there, but we do need to find ways to sort of allow space for everyone. Um, and maybe this is, we've already seen it to some extent in places like Start Point off Devon, where they have a long-standing arrangement for different types of gear in different areas. Um, but yeah, ultimately, I think there is common ground between all sectors of the fishing industry and a lot of NGOs, not all of them, but a lot of NGOs who basically, like I said before, they want the same thing. They want healthy oceans. Now, obviously, there are some extreme NGOs who might tell you there's no such thing as a sustainable fishery, or we all should give up fish, and there's not common ground there. But I'd say a lot of them, there is common ground. And, some of the most productive meetings that I've been in, which have involved lots of different people, NGOs, fishermen, scientists, managers, is where we allow the time for some good discussions, and actually start to identify that kind of common ground. And that is quite refreshing. You're never going to agree on everything, but I think that's the way forward for sure.
You made a comment. I would like to just ask you to elaborate on it. I knew about the octopus situation. Did you say
Oh, yeah.
where's the havoc coming from?
Yeah, so basically the octopus are they're getting into crab and lobster pots, and they're eating the catch of crabs and lobsters. Um, and in some areas, they did have escape hatches that were designed to let out juvenile crabs and lobsters to protect that element of the stock. But the octopus are able to get out of those holes. So they were effectively just going down these lines of pots, like, I think somebody likened it to McDonald's, just sort of snacking on them. Um, which, so the fishermen are pulling up and I've seen the photos of this, pots just full of bits and pieces um, of octopus and crabs. It's pretty devastating. They have now changed that rule so to say they can close those escape hatches. Um, but if they do so, they're not allowed to land crab or octopus. They have to just land octopus. And people are doing this, and there's so many octopus. They're coming up in, every type of fishing gear now. Trawls and static nets and pots. It's really quite incredible how many are out there, and we're not really sure what's going on. It's probably climate change. It's warmer sort of conditions both last summer and over this past winter, and it seems like they're probably now breeding here, which is could be quite a concern.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, these are the situations that we have to face. Some fishermen are making a lot of money out of them. One boat in Newland last week, I think, landed 20 tons, which
Wow.
they're getting like, I think, 7 or 8 pounds a kilo. So you can do the maths there. That's a lot of money. Um, but they're not only probably directly affecting the fishing operations, but they're obviously going to be eating a lot of stuff on the seabed as well when they're not in crab pots and nets. And the effects of that remains to be seen. But they could potentially be driving down their favourite food sources, which are crab and lobsters and scallops and other shellfish. Yeah, so it's quite a concerning situation, to be honest. And no one really knows how it's going to end, or if it will, like if they're here now or if they'll be gone in a few months. So yeah, I'm hoping to do some work on this, but we'll see what we can do.
It's really interesting, but is there not a train of thought that if they're going to be catching them by the 20 ton, will they last that long?
Yeah, well, this is the other thing. Exactly. So, of course, it's a non-quota species. There's no management on them. 20 tons was exceptional,
Hmm.
very exceptional. But that we are seeing, at a lot of the fish markets, daily landings from all the boats of sort of 15 or 20 tons quite often. They don't live very long, so they only live 1 to 2 years. So they might, and they generally sort of die after they've bred. So yes, they're being caught, but then if they are breeding over here and the conditions have now changed so that their young survive, then they'll be back again next year. Potentially. We don't know, unfortunately.
And is the feeling that it's something that's come into the grounds, or maybe they've been there but weren't been caught before?
There's a lot of different theories. Some people sort of think they've migrated from, say, the north coast of Africa, or other places. Personally, I don't think that's the case. I don't think there's any real evidence for mass migration of octopus. But we do know, for example, a colleague of mine does a lot of work with drop-down video cameras, and she was telling me last summer they were seeing a lot of very small juvenile octopus. So, I get the feeling that it's just a sort of perfect storm in that some have got here, they've had a really good year last year breeding, and then because we've had the temperatures of the water is so warm at the moment, and it was right over winter and everything, that they've survived, and maybe in other years they wouldn't, but now they're here. you
Yeah,
know, um, yeah, and so unless things change, okay, the ones that are here now might either be caught or naturally die, but they'll have already bred, and yeah, and we could see them again next summer. But we shall see. It's
yeah.
really uncertain.
There's not going to be any danger of them coming off the non-quota species then.
Not in a hurry. I don't think things happen rapidly in fisheries
No, that's
management
true.
today,
That's
and it's
true.
so hard. I think it would be so hard to assess them. Because
Yeah,
they're just. How do you? I mean, again, I'm hoping to do some work on this using these drop-down cameras and other methods to try and assess them. But it's a big area. It's going to be challenging.
it sounds like it would be an interesting uh, one for, do you know Tom Rossiter?
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
He's catch cam
Yes.
technology.
Yeah. I know him. Yeah.
He's got some fascinating footage on different situations in the seabed.
Okay. I better get in touch with him then.
There's one incredible. I think it's maybe on his website. He was working with a guy on the Clyde, and it actually shows. I'll maybe see the link and I could send it to you.
Okay.
They're trawling, going along the seabed, obviously the trawl, and here's the seals outside the net, and
Mm,
they're bumping their nose on the cod end. And
really.
obviously, by doing that, small fish are escaping and they're eating them.
Mm,
And in one case, one of them one of the seals goes right into the net, into the cod end,
gosh.
and then comes back out again.
Swims back out. That's amazing, isn't it? Gosh. Yeah. They're clever.
Yeah, yeah, that's for sure. I think
Yeah.
it's amazing, and the actual fisherman Tom was out with says he says, well, he's entitled to, he thought he was so clever, he's entitled to what he's.
Let him get away with that one. Fair enough.
A policy
Yeah.
increasingly shaped by public pressure. How do we ensure that science stays at the heart of the conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the job for us scientists, really, to keep, I guess, both doing the science but also communicating it in a way that's accessible to politicians, certainly decision makers, but also members of the public, because ultimately, we do need public support for science. And yeah, I mean, we're seeing what's going on over the ocean in another country, um, across the Atlantic, and they are starting to ignore science in a lot of cases, or sort of cherry pick science to design their government policy, and that's really dangerous. So yeah, I mean, I put a lot of effort into that, personally, in terms of trying to make sure that my science is shared as widely and sort of in as accessible way as possible. And I'll take any opportunity to um, talk to a politician or anyone who wants to listen. I mean, I was lucky enough to meet Daniel Zeichner just a couple of weeks ago down in Plymouth, and we had half an hour with him to talk about that pollock fishing industry science partnership project, and he was very receptive, and he really liked this idea of scientists and fishermen working together more closely in the future.
Good.
So I think we've all got to try and put those messages out there, um, that ultimately, that's what's going to lead to a better future. Not just flying by the seat of your pants or doing what you think right without backing it up with some evidence and careful study.
In fairness to a lot of fishermen and meetings I've been at with the fishing into the future,
Yeah.
fishermen are fishermen want science.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is great. And I was in a fishing into the future meeting in Plymouth, maybe 6 weeks ago or something like that. Uh, which was really interesting. We heard a lot of different views. Um, they questioned us, which was fine, which was good. Um, and that's what you expect. Ultimately, the science that is done and the sort of policy recommendations. I don't make management, but sometimes maybe I have a bit of an influence, and my colleagues do as well. And that can affect people's lives. So I absolutely understand that they want to know it's being done as well as possible, um, and that they get involved as well. Because I think if if the management of your industry is affected by um, the science that's going on, then you should have a part of that. And like I say, and it works both ways. There's so much that we in that Pollock project. Okay, this was on recreational charter boats. We recorded data from 800 fishing trips over just over 2 years. Now, if you chartered and it didn't cost much money, people were compensated. But if you chartered a research vessel from the government to do that, it probably, I don't even know how much it would cost, hundreds of thousands, maybe more. You know, and so, but it's not just about that. It's about the fact that we all work together as a team to gather that data, because you know there was some very sort of sudden management measures to restrict the pollock fishery, but there was also a real need for better data, and I think people are a lot more confident now that we have better data. There's still more work to be done, but we're going in the right direction.
When you mentioned the pollock fishing, what would you feel
Mm.
would be the most effective way of helping the stock? Some countries would go by putting quotas, but other countries would maybe put restrictions on activity, the fishing days.
Yeah, I mean, generally you need a mix of the two things. Quotas by themselves are probably more effective, but just by themselves they're not enough. So they're better because they should more directly control the mortality of fish, and therefore how many fish are being taken out relative to the health of the population. Just using effort control is a little bit less precise. But for example, with the pollock fishery, I mean, we mostly worked on the recreational side of things in terms of management, and we have recommended a series of management measures: bag limits, closed seasons, increases in minimum size. Um, in the case of recreational fishing, you can't control the effort in terms of the number of licenses very easily, or it's not really what you're trying to do. But um, in terms of a fishery like that, which is in a bit of a crisis at the moment because the stock's low and the fishermen, are very heavily restricted. I think you need to make some decisions about who needs the fishing more than others. And there's some
Yeah.
small, for example, small inshore boats that are fishing with hook and line. That pollock is one of the main ways they make their money. Their impact on the stock is relatively minimal. They're selling a high-end premium product, and I think you've got to make those decisions about. It's not. It gets beyond biology, and you have to start thinking about the social and economic consequences of management, and um, and perhaps giving priority to some of those people, and not so much the larger boats that are more flexible and can fish for other species. But yeah, it's complicated. You can't please everyone, unfortunately.
No, no. Who do you feel drives the narrative? Scientists, NGOs, the media,
Gosh, it's a real
or
it's
figures
a
like Attenborough?
well, they're all important. I think it ebbs and flows. Yeah, I wouldn't say one particularly has, you know, a dominance over others. They all feed in, and some things get a lot of attention by one sector, and then it goes back the other way. Um, I think what's really important, though, ultimately, is the way that, for example, fisheries and our marine environment is managed and used is largely down to politicians and businesses, big businesses. So my sort of catchphrase on that is vote and shop carefully. Think about the ones who are going to represent your views of how things should be done. And of course, again, they won't do everything. They won't make you happy all the time, but think about the ones that sort of represent you better, um, because they'll be listening to all these voices and then they'll make up their own mind. And so you want the ones who are really, um, putting a lot of thought into it and being open-minded and listening to those voices and then making hopefully carefully considered decisions.
Yeah, good point. Good point. Trawling and food security. Can we feed a growing population without bottom trawling?
Yeah, well, I did some simple maths on this in anticipation. So trawling at the moment provides about 25% of um, wild caught seafood. Wild caught seafood provides about 50% now of aquatic foods. So the rest comes from aquaculture. So if you wanted to sort of convert that, then you would say bottom trawling provides 12 to 13% of aquatic foods. That suddenly doesn't sound like a lot, but it actually is a lot. It's millions of tons of seafood, and it's a lot of jobs and it's a lot of livelihoods. So yeah, I mean, there'd be a big hole if we immediately banned bottom trawling. So that, I'm certainly not suggesting that. Um, so, and I don't think anyone's suggesting it, and I don't think it's necessary because, first of all, we're seeing a lot of innovation, and we also know that there are areas that are relatively resilient, sorry, that recover well to this sort of thing. Um, and then I guess there's this idea of setting aside certain areas, in priority for the fishing industry. And a bit like on land, we don't, we have fields where we grow crops. And I think it's not quite the same clearly because the ocean's a bit more dynamic, but I think taking a bit more of that approach could definitely help moving forwards. You're not going to see a forest in the middle of a field where you're growing potatoes, but we've come to accept that, and we are, we are also. I mean, I'm no expert in this, but farming practices are also evolving to make them, more environmentally friendly, and I think we can see the same thing happening with fishing. I mean, and who knows what the future holds, right? So, for example, there's I don't know if you've heard about this. There's a company in Norway that called Ava Ocean that have developed this way of catching scallops. It's all quite secret. Um, Ask Mike Kaiser about it when you talk to him, but because I think he knows more than me. But basically, it's a sort of giant Hoover that floats above the sea, or is towed slowly along above the seabed, has a lot of cameras on it, and when it sees a bed of scallops, it basically sucks them up one by one. And so that's obviously a very new technology, but it's going to be a lot more selective than, because it just specifically targets where the scallops are. So who knows what the future holds, right? That's new now, but like maybe you could see a future where that sort of thing is driven by AI and um, and really reduces the impact. I don't know, like crazy things could happen, um, and I think we just need to be open to those new ideas, like I said, and to support them going forward.
I think it's fantastic that the industry is open. Well, I would say it's fairly open to new technology, and
Mm.
I don't feel it's an industry that the word change frightens people.
No, which is good, and that's just as well because particularly now things are changing faster probably than ever before in all sorts of ways, and fishermen are incredibly innovative. History sort of tells us that, and yeah, so more power to them. Basically, is what I would say.
When you were answering that earlier, and you used the term wild caught. I was just think
Right. Yes.
I was just thinking. I thought it was really fantastic, and I hadn't seen it before. But we were out in your home country, Australia,
Right.
and we were down at the Sydney Fish Market, and here was
Oh
all the
yeah.
stalls. Wonderful, what a display
Mm-mm.
of seafood, and obviously
Yeah.
different species. And you might say, well, this is different to us because there would be species that would be wild caught and farmed, but
Hmm.
they had labels on the trays telling the public what that. So the public knew when they were making
Okay.
a decision what was.
Mm.
I think would I be right in saying barramundi was one?
Yeah, barramundi can be either farmed or wild caught, so it's a delicious fish. Probably one of my favorite fish to eat. So yeah, I mean that's great, and I think it comes back to some of our earlier points about education, about sort of you know how fisheries operate, the diversity of fisheries, how important they are to coastal communities, but also this sort of information about how they're caught. And I think retailers and restaurants are catching on to this. I mean, I was at a meeting in the Marine Stewardship Council just 2 weeks ago, and we were joking because um, somebody went, across the road and got some fish and chips, and there was a label saying, your chips came from Harry on Jersey, who grew the potatoes, and Hans in Iceland, who caught the cod, and this sort of thing. People love that, right? Hopefully, it was true. Um, I think it's just so important to connect consumers to their food sources and to really think about it and to value it more. Um, I mean, this is a general point, but I think one of the biggest environmental issues that we have in the world is waste. And that's because people don't always respect things, whether it's food or products or clothes or whatever. You hear about statistics like 30% of food is wasted. I mean, that's just outrageous.
Yeah,
Um, so I think, and in terms of seafood, it is some seafood is more of a staple product, but then a lot of it really should be seen as a luxury product. And I can't remember his name, but it was a chap on online recently, a fishmonger, and he said, you should see a piece of, a nice loin of cod as being the equivalent of a sirloin steak. Like it is a high end product.
totally
Don't
agree with
expect
it.
to eat that every night. But when you do, give it the respect it deserves and enjoy it appropriately. Um, and I think that's a really key thing for people to remember.
Totally. And going back to your other point, I found when I was running my restaurant, every menu, Bryce, I had on a footer on the bottom of it, and it said what boat landed the fish
Okay.
and where he was fishing. And I had
Oh, there
a
you go.
in my environmental and ethical policy, I had a rule that nothing I'd served nothing in the restaurant out with a 50-mile radius of the
Oh,
restaurant.
brilliant. Okay. Yeah,
And
good on you.
some people used to say, well, is it not a bit restrictive? And actually, you say, well, funny enough, we're spoiled for choice. But
Yeah, yeah,
but
yeah.
the point that I would picked up on when you and reminded me when you said that, Bryce, was what a trust it gave between our customer and ourselves. Just seeing that,
Mm-mm. Yeah, yeah, for sure.
I felt it was fantastic from that point of view. It really put a great trust.
Yeah, that's brilliant.
Eh, And going on, I asked AI to pick a question for this series, and here's the response: a challenge to Attenborough. If you had five minutes with Sir David, what would you say?
Yeah, gosh. So I've met Attenborough once about 10 years ago. I was so sort of starstruck. I struggled to say anything, but we made a joke because it was at a birthday party. I think it was his 90th, which it wasn't his own. Like, that sounds a bit pretentious. He came to visit the University of York where I worked at the time, and he gave an event, and they arranged a little party for him. I was lucky enough to get invited, and so yes, he made a joke uh, about getting old and his birthday cake and making wishes and stuff. So, and I laughed with him and whatever, but I didn't say it or ask him anything too profound. I mean, look, I think if I had a few minutes with Attenborough, I think I would probably go for the big questions, which was, what have been his secrets to living a long and very successful life, and what are the three key things he's learned along the way. I think I would, yeah, focus on those big picture questions, to be honest, um, rather than anything too specific, and hopefully I'd remember some of it.
Okay, it was interesting meeting him. Well, that must have been 9 years ago then, because I think he's just
Yes, of
recently had his
course, he's just turned
99th
99.
birthday.
Yeah, yeah. So there you go. Yeah, I can work it out.
Yeah. Which book or article do you think everyone in fisheries should read?
Yes, so I thought about this, and this is a book that maybe not many people have heard of, but I read this when I was doing my PhD. My PhD was in Australia, up on the Great Barrier Reef at Lizard Island, um, and we had during one of my field trips we had quite a strong cyclone come over the island, and there was only one cyclone-proof building at the research station, which also had a small library in it. And I found this book called Words of the Lagoon by a chap called Bob Johannes. And it really, I think it really sort of changed my perspectives at the time, because I had done some work in fisheries, but at that point it was more about biological stuff, about how like coral reef fish ecosystems functioned and things. But I read this. So Bob, he was a fisheries scientist working in the South Pacific in the 1970s. Um, and he decided that, he was a guy who did all the modeling and all this sort of stuff, like high end, going to big international meetings and things. But he decided that to really understand the ocean and fishing, he needed to know more about what traditional fishermen knew about those things. And so he said, I think I'm going to go and live on an island among a fishing community and see what I can find out. And his colleagues laughed at him at the time. Like this, as I said, it's in the 1970s. But he did it anyway. And I think I was trying to find this out. He might have spent something like a year living in Palau. And basically, his mission was to discover, test, and record the knowledge possessed by these native fishermen of Palau in Micronesia in the Pacific. And it's a fantastic read. And of course, they know so much, right? I mean, they're out there nearly every day. They've got information that's been passed down by generation after generation, because a little island like, or the islands of Palau, this is the main food source. So they rely on knowing everything about the ocean for their survival. And yeah, I think that was just a fantastic book to read. And like I say, it shaped my thinking ever since about, being open minded, being open to new ideas, and really also valuing the expertise and knowledge of people who spend the most time at the sea. I'd love to spend more time at sea. I try and get out there as much as I can, but I also spend a lot of time behind a computer. Unfortunately, that's the lot of a scientist. Um, so yeah, I think it's a fantastic book. It's hard to find these days, but I did look on the internet, and you can download it as an ebook or as on Kindle. So yeah, I highly recommend it.
When you talk about that, what the importance to you as a scientist is seasons and nature.
Yeah, I mean, it's like it drives the rhythm of life, really, doesn't it? Whether it's land or sea, and it obviously affects what happens in the ocean, but also it affects the activities of people. Um, Maybe a good example is from my PhD, actually, because I spent something like 700 hours underwater looking at fish throughout the seasons for 2.5 years. And, on the Great Barrier Reef, you just saw incredible seasonal changes in terms of the abundance of fish, the types of fish, this real explosion of juvenile fish in the start of our summer, which was sort of November, December time. Um, and then all the changes that happened around that. So new fish, schools of fish would come from elsewhere to try and eat these small fish, and then the coral would spawn, and you had this just incredible explosion of life. And then by about say March, things had kind of settled down again, and they wouldn't, you know, things wouldn't happen so much for the next 6 months, and then it would all start again. And some years it would be different species or more of one than others. But yeah, that was a fantastic opportunity to really see that for myself. So yeah, and of course, like I say, there's seasons affect so many other things. Obviously, they affect in terms of fishing, the ability of fishermen to go to sea, um, what species are there, but they also affect the markets. So when I used to do a lot of work on scallop fisheries, one of the big things was they'd fish a lot just before Christmas, because particularly for the French market, everyone wanted to be um, eating coquille Saint-Jacques, for their Christmas gatherings, and so
Yeah.
they could get really good prices at that point. Yeah, so seasons are so important in many ways.
Does it had an influence on you as you develop your career and studies and things?
Uh, yes, I guess in terms of doing the science, one of the things I do, for example, I mean, this sounds a bit obvious maybe, but I've in some cases I've been running like annual monitoring programs, and you have to be very careful to do them at literally the same time of year each year. If you want to compare what's happening this year with last year, you can't do last year's survey in February and this year in September, because it's chalk and cheese. So it'd be great if I could be out there all the time. With the pollock project, we weren't out there all the time, but we had fishermen recording data, and we very clearly saw those seasonal changes. Um, One of the things with pollock is they aggregate to breed at the start of the year, so you see that happening. You see the catch rate start to go up, and then tailing off. And then there's another little peak for reasons we're not quite sure of later in the summer, and then they decline and they come back up again. So, yeah, I mean, it very much influences the way I do my science for sure.
Really interesting to hear that. I'm sorry for jumping back and forth, but I just wanted to go just in my mind with when we were talking earlier just recently about the quota system and days restriction. I
Oh yeah.
I think it's felt here here as in UK.
Hmm.
The biggest mistake made is putting a value on quota and license, because they reckon that we're in a situation just now where it's almost going back. You go certainly going back to my time and after that.
Mm-hmm.
Young people in fishing communities, all they ever wanted to do was be a fisherman. They would be on the deck.
Yeah, yeah.
Their ambition was to eventually be skipper and hope possibly have their own boat. That's impossible now.
Yeah, it's really sad, and I know exactly what you mean. And then, on the other end of that, you have these slipper skippers, which I'm sure you're familiar with that phrase. People
Yep,
who just lease their quota and never actually go to sea themselves and make quite a healthy living out of doing it. I mean, that just seems to be fundamentally wrong. Um, and I think there should be a kind of sunset clause for those quota owners who, if you don't use it, you lose it kind of thing. One thing, and I can't remember all the details, but I went over to Maine in America, gosh, about 7 or 8 years ago, and learning a lot about the way they manage their fisheries there. And the big thing there is the lobster fishery, particularly
yeah,
inshore. And they have a really great scheme for getting young people into the fishery. So um, I think one of the ways they license fishermen is just numbers of pots. And so you start off And as a young fisherman, I think you sort of have to prove yourself, first of all, working with somebody else. And then if you've done a certain number of years, then you're entitled to get your own boat and have a small number of pots. And then if you fish those, say whatever it is, let's say 150 days a year or something, then the next year you get 20% more, and on it goes until if you prove yourself over about a 5-year period that fishing is your life and you're fully committed to it, then you get a full license and full allocation. And it's a way of just bringing young people into the fishery, and that's so important for all sorts of reasons. I mean, just keeping coastal communities and their sort of vibrancy and the history and culture alive, and supplying seafood as well. And unfortunately, you know, um, that's not happening very well here in the UK. I think the average age of a fisherman is sort of in their mid 50s, and there's a real struggle to get young people into the industry. And I
Yeah.
know there's some good initiatives trying to change that. And again, this new coastal, what's it called? Coastal Recovery Fund. Anyway, the one that was announced by Keir Starmer the other week.
Okay. Yeah.
I think we'll have some money aside for training, and yeah, let's hope that it goes to the right place.
Well, I know Mike Park, the SWF, Scottish Whitefish Producers Association, they're building a massive premises just now, and that's one of the things it's going to be for
Okay,
is getting young people trained.
yeah, that's good. Yeah,
And the Clyde Fishermen's Association, they've got it's a they have a bus they fitted out, and they go around schools, and
oh right, okay,
so there is people trying. There is.
yeah, absolutely. There's some good stuff going on. We just, it just we need more of it, and really, I guess to find the secret to unlocking it. I mean, fishing's a pretty hard way of life. I think it's fair to say. I've been on enough fishing boats to see that, and um, you know, I've seen this some of the boats in the States again, where some of the bigger vessels have like movie rooms and Wi-Fi and like regular hours, like on shift work and stuff like this, and gyms and all sorts of things that we couldn't dream of over here on most fishing boats. Um, that's not practical everywhere, but I think unlocking the secret to how to get more young people involved is really, really important moving forward.
Very, very much the case. One word to describe the future of British fisheries.
Gosh, I would say evolving. So I'm going to have to explain that now. But like, things are changing rapidly. Um, I think certainly in terms of climate change is shifting the distribution of stocks. And in some cases, like we've seen with octopus, I mean, it might be one off, but they might be here to stay. We're seeing these dramatic changes. So if you look at the predictions from scientific climate change models, they mostly just go in a fairly straight line, up this, there's going to be more of this and less of that. And what's really hard to get a handle on is the unexpected things that happen. So another thing down my way is the arrival of tuna. And we have enormous schools of bluefin tuna off the south coast now that had never been seen 10 years ago. For 70 years they were missing, and now they're here. And again, I've been out on boats over the last couple of summers and seen schools of thousands of them. I mean, there's
Wow.
literally white water. It's spectacular.
Yeah.
um, there is a recreational catch and release fishery that is doing quite well. There's a small commercial fishery, but a lot of people ask what's going on with their effect on other species. How much are they eating of everything else?
Yeah.
We don't know. Um, and as I said, then again we've got like the octopus coming. So these dramatic changes very hard to predict, and so the fishing industry has got to be flexible, and it is good at being flexible. But there are going to be challenges. And then, yeah, the other big one is obviously offshore renewables. Are moving at a pace, and we've already got a lot of wind farms. We've already got, big plans for expansion, sort of fourfold increase in offshore renewables in the next 10 years or something like that. Floating wind farms are probably going to be even more challenging to deal with. And I'm sort of developing some research on trying to find ways that that fishermen can work around with offshore wind developers a bit more effectively. We have to face the facts that there's powerful forces at work there, and the UK has a legal sort of obligation to get to net zero by 2050, and these things are coming. And so I think the fishing industry, and again, I know lots of people are working really hard on this, needs to engage with the developers to try and there's small things you can do just in terms of the placement and orientation of the turbines that might allow fishing operations to still operate inside them. Interestingly, as I said, I'm from Australia, and there they don't have any operational wind farms at all yet, but they have big plans to develop them over the next kind of 10 years. So this project that I'm doing is working with some people over there to say, what can you learn from the UK? And what can, because I think what happened in the UK was they were a novel idea to begin with, and then all of a sudden they started being, expanding rapidly, being put all over the place, and probably other stakeholders were caught on the back foot a bit. So in Australia, they have the opportunity to get on the front foot. And so, yeah, as part of I'm going over there on holiday later this year anyway, but I'll be going to a conference over there, and we've done some work looking at exactly that. I surveyed about a dozen sort of key representatives from the fishing industry over here and other stakeholders to say if you could start again, what would you like to see happen, basically, and a few other questions. So yeah, that's another big challenge, clearly, and I think that's why I say evolving. I don't think it's all change as we look forward over the next few decades. But with the right will, with the right sort of innovative spirit that the fishing industry has shown it has, then I think it can accommodate it. But things will probably look very different in 20, 30 years.
I think it's pretty good the fact that you're going to be involved and you're going to be there, because I'm just trying to get my head around how Australians are going to be, how happy they're going to be thinking they're going to be learning something from the UK.
Well, I'm not going to tell them they need to learn how to play cricket. Don't worry. That wouldn't go down too well. You're dead right. I mean, I think the only way I can get away with it is the fact that I'm Australian myself. But yeah, the title of my talk is literally that. What can Australia learn from the UK when it comes to wind farms and fisheries? So yeah, we'll see what reception I get.
I remember being out there at a house party, and this guy was saying, you might maybe you've heard it before, maybe it's a regular one in Australia, but when a plane lands in Sydney, well, it's Sydney we were in, plane lands in the airport, how do they know it's come from Britain before it stops taxiing?
Yeah, because the whining continues after the engine's turned off. Yeah, no, I know that one. Look, I'm not going to go down that page.
No.
I've lived here for 25 years. The UK has been very good to me.
Good.
So
that's a good way. That's a good way of leaving that one. Where can our listeners follow you online?
So I'm on Blue Sky and also on LinkedIn. So the benefit of having a somewhat unusual name is you should be able to find me fairly easily.
That's great. Well, I think we can fold up. I'd just like to thank you very much. That's been really inspiring and almost educational in some of the things you talk about. So thanks very much. It's been great having you on the show.
Thanks so much, Jim. Thanks for your kind words. It's been a real pleasure chatting to you.